and it's at Gordonsville, Smith County. Is where he's buried.
Okay, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
If any of you ever go in the Methodist church, they have two stained glass windows, and you can see Julie Bruce's name right there, and you can see Sim Watson's name right there if you ever visit him. And then before I turn it over, just want to give two announcements. We're going to do our cemetery tour again on September 24th. We have people dressed in period costume, and they give the history of Spring Hill at different stops. And this year we'll be on Wreaths Across America, if any of you are interested in that. So they place a wreath at the graves of veterans throughout the U.S. And with that, I think I hit my half hour. Hopefully I didn't talk too long.
Is Hardin Alley named for that Hardin,
Do what now?
Hardin Alley?
Yeah, that's same, because that was basically
It's
his
his name
driveway.
Uh-oh, I gotta follow that. I learned more about Spring Hill today than I think I may have ever known. That's actually, what he's done here is what I always try to explain to people all over the state of Tennessee to do, because I've got 32,000 cemeteries in the database so far. It's not about the cemeteries themselves, it's about what they matter to the people who lived, and bringing a cemetery alive like you have done, bringing the people alive so that people understand that they're not just stones. I mean, that's one of the things that I really, really champion all over Tennessee to get people to do. Education is key, and having been a former educator myself, you know, there are actually sites here in Tennessee where people are including educational programming with state standards and things like that with cemeteries, so that they can, you know, get high school kids or other kids to understand. It's like the cemetery is a part of a community, and I think that you're doing a great job doing what you're doing. Thank you. Now, okay, I didn't know where my glasses were. Here they are. No, that was excellent. I'm Graham Perry, and I am from the Tennessee Historical Commission. And although since I've worked for the state, I realize that they just give you titles to sound big. So I'm the State Historic Cemetery Preservation Specialist, and it sounds really nice and long and official, but really I'm just this guy that got this job, and I'm the first one of them because Tennessee never had one before. It was only because of recent legislation that this position was created. Other states, like Arkansas and North Carolina, people that I'm in touch with all the time, my counterparts in other states, have had historic cemetery programs for a long time. So I'm just trying to get us up to speed. Actually, I'm trying to beat them, but don't tell them. All right. So is my slideshow working right? Yes. It is. Okay. So I'm going to tell you all a little bit about cemetery law. I've actually been down here several times recently in Rutherford and Murray County. I actually got called to, were you there when I got called when the developer was doing something in Spring Hill, and I came up just to say, oh, and save the cemeteries?
No, you came down to speak.
I did that too.
I invited you to
Yes.
speak, yes.
So I spent a lot of time down here, and every time I come down here, I learn so much. Okay. Well, Tennessee law overview. Now, normally I can stretch this as long, when people say, oh yeah, can you talk for 45 minutes? I'm like, yeah. Well, this is 30 minutes, and I'm going to try to stick to that today. And I'm sure I'll get some questions because I get them a lot. So, Tennessee law overview. I like to put William Blackstone up here because I want people to understand that nationally, cemetery law derives from just English common law or custom, as it were. And English common law about cemetery comes from Roman times. So our cemetery laws in some form or fashion have been in existence since ancient Rome. And who knows besides then, before then maybe. So what happens when people start writing. So Tennessee law overview. Tennessee law is it's not as developed as other states, and we're still trying to work on that. That's one of the things I'm trying to work on with the cemetery committee, is we're trying to investigate how Tennessee laws can be streamlined to make the laws less confusing for people. But I've also talked a lot with our attorney at TDEC, and he and I have figured out a lot of very interesting he's interpreted things. I'm not a lawyer. I have to say this right now. I'm not an attorney. I'm not a lawyer. So you can't just say, well, he's the law. And he said, basically, when you get into these cemetery issues with law, your better lawyers are the ones that are going to win, probably. But what my job is to help people navigate that. It doesn't matter if it's a landowner. It doesn't matter if it's a family member of a cemetery. I help everybody. And I try to help them navigate this crazy thing we call the Tennessee law. So the strong points of Tennessee law, we have a Family Graves Protection Act, and that is in TCA 46-8. And we'll talk about that. We're going to talk about all these. The weak point of that is many don't read it before they take actions on cemeteries. See this all the time. Strong point, relocation process is very clear. It's in TCA 46-4. The problem is relocation of graves can be expensive, especially the larger the cemetery, and non-compliance can be seen as worth the risk if somebody can get away with it. Strong point, tax incentives exist, and of course the weak point is the benefits are tiny. I'm trying to work on that. I'm trying to get some incentive going. Also, desecration law is clear. It's not only in TCA 46-1-313, but it's also in TCA 39. But the enforcement depends on the locality, and that's one of the things that one of my jobs is to try to make sure that when localities don't know what they're supposed to do in a situation like desecration, that I remind them and help them understand, that's a crime. You're supposed to actually file a report when somebody requests it. Doesn't happen all the time. But most law enforcement does what they're supposed to, and it's just every once in a while you'll find a locale somewhere that doesn't understand. And actually a lot of times they'll be confused at what they're supposed to do anyway because they never have the problem before. So that's what I'm here for. I'm championing and helping law enforcement understand what the desecration law is and what they're supposed to do. And the criminal penalties is a strong point. It is in TCA 39-17, we'll talk about that. The problem is it's defined in TCA 39 and not TCA 46. And that always drives me crazy because I have to go to different Tennessee TCA sections to find things that have to do with cemeteries. And one of the things I do is I pour through these to see if there's any others that have to do with cemeteries or could be interpreted that way. Another strong point is we have Hines versus Tennessee 1911, and it strengthens the existing law. It is also a precedent that is recognized all over the United States. The problem is not all of it is included in Tennessee Title 46. Let me see. Okay, so TCA 46, I'll just go with, and I'm going to go into more detail in this, so I'll just try to go over this right now in a quick way. TCA 46-4, it describes what you're supposed to do if you are terminating a cemetery or trying to change land use if there's a cemetery on it. 46-4-101, it says that first you have to prove to a court that a cemetery is abandoned or threatened. What does that mean? Well, we'll talk about that. 464102, it defines interested persons, which basically are family members. It does not say descendants, it says family members. And I guess that's so that you can have cousins and things like that, because some people don't have children. 464103, it describes the process that you have to go through to get approved for termination. And 464104 have the provisions for reinterment once you have gotten the okay to do so by the court. Now, TCA 468, it kind of counters some of this. It's called the Family Burial Grounds Protection Act, and if any of those who don't like it, it's Steve McDaniel's fault. I'm just letting you know. No, we talk to him all the time, but he was the big champion of this. 468103, it describes that there is a duty for landowners to protect graves. Now, what that means, we'll see. 468103A, a cemetery must be on a deed prior to any land transfer. It is the landowner's responsibility to make sure of that. And it is state law. It's not just a suggestion. 468103B defines the protection boundary of a cemetery, which, well, I'll say what it is in a minute. But basically, it says you have to keep clear of the cemetery within this much room. And 468104C, it says if you don't like any of this, you can petition for relocation and go back to 464. So, pretty simple. So TCA 461, the definitions of a cemetery. In Tennessee, it is any land or structure in this state dedicated to and used or intended to be used for the interment of human remains. That's key, human remains. A pet cemetery is not considered a cemetery under this definition, although I do like to put them in my database anyway, just because it's fun. One grave in Tennessee equals a cemetery. That is not the same in other states. I think Arkansas it's 4, and I don't know what it's called if it's less than 4. I guess I'll have to ask Holly Hope about that. A cemetery can even have no graves. All that it needs is intention of use of a cemetery. If somebody declares this area is a cemetery, it's a cemetery. Cemetery purposes. I love to read these legal kind of things. Any and all things requisite or necessary for, or incident, or convenient to the establishment, maintenance, management, operation, improvement, and conduct of a cemetery. The preparation of the premises for interment, and the interment of the human dead, and the care, preservation, and embellishment of cemetery property. If you don't know that, just go ask some lawyer guy. But that's what it says in Tennessee law, and that is pretty descriptive. Let's see. So TCA 464 describes termination of use of a cemetery. This is very important with development going on and things like that. And you and us in Williamson County and Nashville, we're all very familiar with this. Rutherford County, we've had some issues there as well. 464101 defines the purpose of the act. You have to basically say, is this cemetery abandoned or neglected? What does abandoned mean? Well, to the Historical Commission, it means nobody's visited it in 50 years. Now, I'm sure that every circuit court is going to have their own definition. But technically, and I need to go find the statute again, but I found somewhere where it actually says its visitation has nothing to do with maintenance. Is the purpose of the property surrounding a cemetery inconsistent with proper reverence? That's important. Do you want your cemetery in the middle of an apartment courtyard? The reason why I bring that up, I mean, there are people that say a cemetery should never be moved ever. But there's another way to look at it in that, is this really where these people need to lie? Is there a better place for them to be moved where they can be revered properly? And again, it's open to interpretation. So 464102 defines interested parties. It can be family members, relatives, and anyone having the right of easement. I think the Department of Archaeology can go into any cemetery they want. I cannot yet. I have to be invited to family cemeteries. But this applies to all cemeteries in Tennessee. It doesn't matter if it's commercial or family or whatever. 464103 describes the actions and proceedings. First, I always tell people this, and this doesn't matter who you are anywhere, landowner, family member, whatever. Check to see if you really own the cemetery, because you may find that you do not. And that's something you can call me about, because I love to help figure that out. The complainant must first publish a notice of intent to remove a cemetery using press sources common to a county. So that doesn't mean you print off flyers and put it in the local record store, okay? You have to use press that is commonly read in your county or listened to. Radio is good too. Step 3, the Chancery Court must then be contacted to petition for termination. You can't just go dig people up yourself and move them. Remaining interested parties are considered defendants in that particular case. So basically, what you're trying to do is give the defendants, the family members, a chance to say, hey, I want to challenge this cemetery removal. Step 4, the petition must be filed with the Tennessee Historical Commission. And we post it on our website. And whenever I get calls where somebody says, oh, well, somebody's about to move these graves in, and I'm always like, I don't have a petition from them. Like, have they gotten a petition? And then I started investigating, and I call people up. I was like, wow, do you have a petition to move graves? You're supposed to, because we're supposed to post it. And, it's kind of fun making people understand that sometimes. 464104, judgments and decrees, termination and removal. The circuit court determines the outcome based on the evidence tied to 464101. And the termination must be done with due care. We have had, matter of fact, that was where somebody just plowed over a cemetery up in Rutherford County, and it was a known cemetery, and people knew it was there, but they plowed over it anyway. That was the first day I walked into this job. That's what I had to deal with. A lot of different things can happen. The main thing is if you are having construction done, if you're a developer, make sure that your crew understands Tennessee law, that even if they just find a cemetery accidentally, they got to leave it alone. You can call me. So, TCA 46.8, Family Burial Grounds Protection Act. The 101, the purpose is intended to provide notice to buyers of property with known burial grounds and grave sites. That means read your state law before you buy something. TCA 46.8.102, the definitions. It defines what a crypt, a grave site, and human remains are. It gets complicated, but it definitely shows these things that they define. They show that a cemetery, it has to be human remains, not pet remains, and it describes what crypts and grave sites are. Now, a grave site does not have to be marked. That's one of the things people think, oh, well, if there's not a headstone there, it's not a cemetery, it's not a grave. Well, yeah, it is. Sorry. Matter of fact, I've been to a lot of recent ones where there were like maybe 3 headstones, and then they're just pit after pit after pit after pit where people were buried. I had a situation up in Rutherford County recently where the guy thought there were 3 graves on his land, and he petitioned for removal, which he was supposed to. He was doing the right thing. And I realized that the 3 graves were African American. I said, sometimes African American cemeteries are a lot bigger than that. So I went to visit, and sure enough, it was a huge cemetery. And I feel really bad for the guy. And I'm sure they're still working it out. I've even worked with the lawyer and the landowner to try to figure out what to do. Because somebody who sold them the land may have known that. And you can always go back and sue those people if they don't do due diligence. I've had there's a guy that's a poster child for landowners who has done that and gotten money, and he calls me up all the time. And he says, can I put a gate up? I said, well, yes, if you make sure that family members have access to it. And he's like, okay, so what I'll do is I'll have a gate with a code, and then when people call me and they want to visit the cemetery, I'll give them the code. I was like, absolutely. That is a landowner that is working with everybody within the state law, and that's what I approve of. So, TCA 468103, it describes that a landowner has a duty to protect graves or crypts. Disturbances are prohibited, and it also says that if you don't like it, you can transfer remains. But you have to go through the petition process. The cemetery owner has the duty to protect known graves. This gets complicated because who owns the cemetery? That's why you have to find out whether you own it or not. If it is a separate tax-exempt plat that has no owner listed, which most cemeteries in Tennessee seem to be, or at least the tax-exempt ones, you don't own it. You have to get, if you want to set aside a cemetery plat as a tax-exempt plat as a landowner, you have to tell your local deeds office and things like that, it's still my cemetery, I just want a tax exemption. Because what happens is, and where it gets confusing, is a lot of times they'll just put, oh, the so-and-so cemetery owns itself. Well, I've talked a lot with our TDEC attorney about that, and we have come to the conclusion that that means, well, I guess it reverts to the family. It's got to be owned by somebody. It can't just own itself and take care, that doesn't work. So, the owner must ensure a cemetery is on a deed prior to sale or transfer, and that is state law. It defines prohibited area. You must leave 10 feet from any grave and 5 feet from a crypt. It has to be undisturbed. So I always suggest to people when they say, well, what should I do about the size of this cemetery? I was like, well, try to figure out what's larger than what you think the cemetery is and just don't bother it in that area. There are specific ways to figure that out. Some of them are kind of expensive. So if you don't, and as you can imagine, you are so fortunate in this place that you have documentation of your cemetery because most cemeteries have none. And it's very scary. 103 also notifies the owner that there's an option in process for removal, and that's TCA 46-4. And if you call me, I'll help you through that. I will. TCA 39-17-3. I just found out something really interesting recently. I had an old version of 39-17-3. So in my former presentations, it said desecration was a Class A misdemeanor, but it is not. It is a Class E felony. It is 39-17-3-13, desecration, honored places or flags. A person may not desecrate a place of worship or burial. What desecration is, well, that's why you get good lawyers and stuff. I know what I think it is. TCA 39-17-3-12 is also defines about corpse abuse. It is a Class E felony, and with Class E felonies, it's prison time to 1 to 6 years and a fine of up to $3,000. If you move a corpse on your own, or if you dig it up and just go, well, you know what, I'm just going to plow over it. That's felony. And if people catch you doing that, you lose the right to vote. I always like to point that out to people. And I also, when people call me and they say their cemeteries have been desecrated, and I was like, oh, so how many headstones are broken? 5. I was like, oh, well, that's 5 counts. So it looks like maybe they won't have like a lot of money to pay, but if they have 5 counts of desecration, that's $15,000. So that's what I always suggest people do when something like that happens.
So Graham, moving a headstone is desecration?
Yes.
That's what I thought.
Except there's a gray area.
That's the gray area.
Families, well, and that's the thing, it's like, who's a family? I mean, basically, when it gets down to family versus family, it becomes a civil matter, and I don't get involved in that. I have a situation up in Davidson County right now where one family member moved all the table graves and the monument to a cemetery down here, actually. But they did not relocate any graves. And it's a real mess because they found out that the actual monuments weren't really marking the graves, and the graves are really a little farther away in another section. So what does that mean? Well, that first one that had the other place was a cemetery because it was actually on the Davidson County survey as a cemetery. But really now there's two cemeteries. There's one where that was mismarked, and then there's one where probably the iron coffins are under the ground. And it's really, really causing a mess with the family members. And of course, people want me to do stuff. I'm like, I'm not a policeman. You're just going to have to. That's people will call me up all the time. And they'll say, "Well, I don't have the money to do all." I'm like, "Well, man, I can't help you." You know, it's like, trust me, I don't have the money to do a lot of, legal stuff either. But there are some things it's like you pick the battles you fight, and if it really means that much to you, fight it. I encourage you to fight it, but I can't give you any money to do that. So, what to do if desecration? It doesn't matter if you're a family member or if you're anyone. Even I can report desecration, and I have. Report it to the local police as soon as possible, and contact the county court to notify them of the desecration. These entities must uphold Tennessee law. If they refuse, call the regional DA and notify me. And if the DA doesn't act, call me and I will call the state. Yes?
Is there any function of straightening up headstones that would be maintenance or something? Is that, you don't
Straightening up headstones is maintenance.
Okay.
Yeah, and because, matter of fact, we do workshops from time to time, and I really started them, but I've started getting people down here that show you how to straighten those up, and also how to do minor repairs. And I can talk to you about that. So corpse abuse,